Greetings and welcome to the My Xbox and Me review of Metal Gear Survive, a spin-off to and continuation of the Metal Gear franchise. Set after the events of Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, players take on the role of a soldier in the Diamond Dogs. Following an attack on Mother Base that ends with an evacuation and a wormhole opening in the sky and swallowing the entire oil rig, you're sent by a shady organisation to the parallel dimension of D-Day after a group of soldiers investigating a potential otherworldly invasion by parasitic life forms. Metal Gear Survive certainly tries to capture the general insanity of the series' previous entries. You're sent to another dimension because wormholes have occasionally opened up in our world, swallowing up people, installations, and more, and sometimes depositing mindless zombie-like creatures with glowing horns protruding from where their heads used to be. Contrary to the pre-release marketing that almost entirely focused on the game's cooperative horde-based multiplayer mode, Metal Gear Survive is mostly a single-player survival experience. After a not-so-brief introduction, you're tasked with exploring the world of D-Day, looking for members of the Karen Corps as well as other survivors who have had the misfortune of being sucked up through a wormhole. It's a nothing story that you can easily ignore. Most of it is told through static scenes reminiscent of the old codec cutscenes from classic Metal Gear games. What passes for a narrative in Survive is an excuse to send you out into the wastes of D-Day to collect memory boards, to restore the memory of your AI companion, or find survivors. Both of which enables the heavy grind of scavenging resources that is the real game here. But from a narrative perspective, this is a Metal Gear game with all the crazy plot twists and pseudoscience you'd expect, minus the charm and goofiness. It probably doesn't help that the lion's share of the dialogue comes from the droning voice of your AI with a split personality, with a male and female voice that both sound like they're doing a Shatner impression. It also doesn't help that 90% of their role revolves around constantly badgering you about your health, hunger, thirst, stamina, and basically annoying you as much as possible when you're out in the field. There aren't any characters, set pieces, or story beats that make a positive impact. Truth be told, I've already forgotten most of what actually happens during the game. D-Day is not a particularly enthralling world, and Metal Gear Survive isn't a particularly nice game to look at. Given its price point, heavy reuse of assets from the Phantom Pain, and the game's spin-off nature, it seems as though Survive was a game put together on a tight budget, a line of thought that its graphics do nothing to dissuade. Inconsistent texturing is the worst offender, with some environmental textures looking sharp and detailed, where others look muddy or blurry even close up. Survive does everything it can to obscure player vision and hide this by use of dust clouds, but even this doesn't mask the fairly poor graphics. Survive also presents a world that does nothing to inspire players to explore it. D-Day is a dull, muted world that's as boring to look at as it is to explore. There's very little cohesion to how the world has been put together. Vast swaths of the world are empty, serving as little more than buffers between smaller areas that you'll need to explore for resources or mission objectives. Even areas designed for looting or missions feel haphazardly put together, as if the development team had a limited palette of assets from the Phantom Pain and simply dropped them almost randomly wherever they needed buildings. It makes Survive's limited exploration feel uninspired as well as incredibly repetitive. From larger areas of connected buildings down to smaller outposts, they all feel far too similar, and you'll soon feel like you're scavenging from the same 2 or 3 areas on a loop. Even the game's interiors all feel the same. Once you've explored one set of ruins, you've explored them all, it seems. Voice acting is all over the place. There are a couple of performances where you can feel the actors are trying their best, but are completely undercut by a poor script. Other performances feel stilted or totally unnatural, with the worst offender by far being your constant AI companion Virgil, whose delivery quickly becomes annoying and whose dialogue you will far and away hear the most frequently. I'm not sure this is necessarily down to the performers themselves, but rather a badly written script and some very strange direction choices. Survive's soundtrack, however, is one of its few bright spots. Music is sparsely used in the game, generally only reserved for moments of danger or actual combat. Its combination of rumbling orchestra and menacing synth works well in conjunction with the action on screen, though it's a damn shame that the action on screen rarely matches the tone the otherwise solid soundtrack sets up. Metal Gear Survive is very rarely an enjoyable game to play. The game ditches a lot of what made the Phantom Pain one of the best games of 2015, and instead leans heavily into its survival mechanics, at great detriment to the overall experience. By focusing on restricted resources and melee combat, you'll rarely be involved with gunplay. So while the Fox engine is just as solid as it was in Metal Gear's previous outing, it's an engine that wasn't really built for melee combat, and not enough tweaking has been done to modify the underlying engine to make up for this. The end result is a combat system that feels sloppy and difficult to manage at the best of times. Direct combat is something you'll frequently be avoiding here, however. Instead, Survive's core gameplay loop revolves around building fences to block enemy advances and poking through them with a stick. Any other strategy aside from running will see you quickly overwhelmed, whether you're exploring or defending your base or a mission objective. Of course, you could also perch yourself on top of a rock or container and poke at enemies from on high. The game's enemies are really too stupid to bother you unless you're overwhelmed by their sheer numbers. And even then, you can flee at your normal jogging speed, because they can't actually keep pace with you. It's here where Survive's gameplay begins to break down. While I'd never expect zombies to be particularly smart, these enemies are so idiotic that you'll struggle to be challenged at all. Survive zombies can't climb, can barely see, don't move very fast, and always run in straight lines, point blank refusing to circumnavigate obstacles even if they're charging a knee-high barricade with nothing on either side of it. There are lore-based reasons why your enemies are so dim-witted, but this doesn't excuse the fact that they barely provide an obstacle even when small hordes of them are charging directly at you. The game does mix things up with different enemy types later on, but these enemies aren't any smarter than the ones that come before them, they just dish out and take more damage. This is compounded by some incredibly punishing survival meters. You'll need to manage oxygen, hunger and thirst meters, all of which rapidly deteriorate and constantly pull you away from exploring and completing missions to hunt for animals and water sources, which will in turn constantly send you back to your base far too often to cook meat and purify water, lest you get sick and start puking every minute or two. For a game that already feels like a grind, these meters triple that feeling, constantly ejecting you from what little enjoyment there is to be found in exploring detail for precious resources. Crafting is the final essential component of the Metal Gear Survive experience. You'll need to find recipes and craft everything from weapons and equipment to clothes, barricades, food, drink, medicine, and more. There are several layers of this thanks to a rudimentary base building mechanic, but it's never an enjoyable experience. The menus are incredibly convoluted, with more than half a dozen different stations for each type of items you can craft, just to make crafting as needlessly complicated as possible. Even the act of gathering materials for crafting is bothersome as opposed to engaging. You'll basically have to run into every building you can find and hammer X about 30 times to pick everything up. Worse still, it's collecting Kuban energy, which is needed for everything from crafting to leveling your character and is primarily harvested from dispatched enemies. This is done manually, meaning for every enemy you down, you'll need to crouch by them and hold X for a good few seconds to gather the energy you need to make progress. If you've downed a group of enemies, which is likely given how combat actually works in the game, you'll spend several minutes at a time simply holding a button down and watching your character mess around with his knife. Quite how this thrilling piece of gameplay made it into the final game, I have no idea, but it makes the act of gathering essential resources something you'll eventually just start skipping altogether. Even after purchasing a skill that increases your gathering speed, gathering multiple resources is still monotonously slow. You can circumvent all of this by simply grinding resources in Survive's co-op-based Horde mode, which tasks you and 3 other players with defending an objective against waves of enemies. It's a fairly decent, if unimaginative mode that is easily the best way to gather resources for your single-player campaign. Though the first co-op mission is level 20 for some reason, meaning enemies are pretty tough and deal considerable damage, you'll still do better grinding multiplayer at lower levels than grinding single-player. What makes all of this all the more frustrating is that there is a half-decent exploration and base-building game to be found in Metal Gear Survive, but it's hidden many hours into the experience behind an incredibly slow, oftentimes unrewarding grind. Once you're in a position where resources aren't quite so scarce, your tactical options aren't insufferably limited, and the survival meters aren't really an issue, exploring the world and playing the co-op can be quite fun. But the barrier to entry is oftentimes frustrating grinding with a payoff that doesn't really feel worth the pain. Metal Gear Survive is a mess, compounded by a series of gameplay mechanics and systems that add far too much complexity for the game to amount to anything other than a thankless grind. What could have been a halfway decent exploration and adventure game is undone by woeful enemy AI, survival mechanics that are far too heavily restrictive, and a monotonous approach to resource gathering. It takes so long for the game to feel like anything other than an unrewarding busy work that you'll be left wondering why you're even bothering, and the payoff of a game that is decent at best really doesn't feel like it was worth bothering with. Thanks very much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving us a like, comment, or even subscribing to the channel. And as always, keep it here at My Xbox and Me for more reviews, commentary, let's plays, and a weekly podcast. Have a great day, guys.